Okay, so going over my legal framework activity, I had to look at the legal framework online, take these scenarios, and determine whether it's reflected in practice as a diagnostician or documented in writing. So the first one says the ARD committee members must review existing evaluation data on the child, including observations by teachers and related service providers, and that I put is reflected in practice. The ARD committee members may conduct its review without a meeting, reflected in practice. The ARD committee members, on the basis of that review and input from the child's parents, must identify what additional data, if any, are needed to determine the present levels of academic achievement and related developmental needs of the child, documented in writing. The LEA must notify the child's parents of their right to request an assessment to determine whether the child continues to be a child with a disability and to determine if the child's educational needs, documented in writing. I actually wanted to ask you about this LEA.
Local Education Agency.
Who is that for us?
PISD.
Okay.
Like whoever's sitting in the IEP meeting as an assistant principal or principal.
Gotcha.
They're the only voting members, the parent and the LEA. So it would be like Christy or...
so that what we say admin in the meeting, that's the LEA.
That's the LEA.
Gotcha. Okay.
And we include all that information in the FIE reports as well.
This about this part right here? Okay. If appropriate, an initial evaluation and reevaluation require a read, and that says reflected in practice. Does that mean that there doesn't have to be any written documentation about a read?
Well, I'm about to do one. We're going to do one here in a couple minutes when we finish this. We're going to do a read, but there will be written documentation that we have reviewed the current data and that we feel additional data is requested in the following areas. So we're going to do that for the student I just had the meeting on.
Oh, okay. So I guess this just means, if appropriate, an initial eval and reevaluation are required. That means you don't have to put in the document about the initial evaluation.
For initial evaluations, our read is the information from the student support team.
Gotcha.
So we have all the documentation from student support team and the things that have been put in place and the things that we've tried and the areas of growth, the areas for concern. Then we talk about moving forward with an evaluation. So our SST paperwork covers that.
Gotcha. Okay. Assessments and classroom-based observations must be reviewed by the ARD committee members as existing evaluation data on the child. I put documented in writing. As deemed appropriate, the LEA must comply with the prior written notice framework reflected in practice. In order to determine whether the child continues to be a child with disability and to determine the child's educational needs, parents have the right to request an assessment reflected in practice, which I guess would also be procedural safeguards. Educational diagnosticians are part of the group that collects or reviews evaluation data, documented in writing. Whether the child is a child with a disability or determining an appropriate educational program for the child, no single measure should be used, reflected in practice. Assessments and other evaluation materials used to assess a child are administered in the form most likely to yield accurate information on what the child knows and can do academically, developmentally, and functionally, reflected in practice. The LEA differentiates between language proficiency and disability for a child with LEP. LEP, reflected.
Limited English proficient. Yeah.
Okay. The initial evaluation must consist of procedures to determine the child's educational needs, reflected in practice. Unless the parent and the LEA agree, re-evals must not occur more frequently than once a year, and that's documented in writing. When a child whose eligibility for special education and related services terminates due to exceeding age eligibility, he or she must have a summary of performance, reflected in practice. That was also a question on the state test that I took on Tuesday about if a child is graduating soon, what the team's responsibility is. And I think I put that it's their responsibility to let the family know that special education services are ending at graduation.
And we do a lot of those at the Solomon Center because our students are either A, aging out, or B, have met their post-secondary goals. So we're writing those so that we can show that everything, what their strengths are, what their areas for growth still are, but they've mastered their goals and they're graduating.
Oh, okay. The views of the child must be included in a summary of performance, documented in writing. A summary of the child's functional performance must be provided by the LEA of the child, to the child, reflected in practice. As part of the summary of performance for children who meet the criteria for graduation due to successful completion of the individualized education program, an FIE must be provided. I put reflected in practice. Fountain High School program. Is that what am I saying that right?
Where
I didn't see it on here. I was just going to ask about. I think I'm saying it wrong. I'll have to look it up. But there was some program that was on the test too about it was like Fountain High School program, or I don't know.
Foundational program.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's when you're not getting all your credits. That has to do with credits and how your transcript
Okay.
goes.
That's not a GED though, right?
Right. No,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
No, that's, you've completed high school. You just may not have completed the areas where the students get endorsements and that stuff.
Oh, okay. Okay, and then this is a couple for the ARD committee. Not less than one special education teacher of the child, or where appropriate, not less than one special education provider of such child, documented in writing.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as possible, following development of the IEP, the local educational agency must ensure that special education and related services are made available to the child in accordance with the IEP. Reflected in practice. ARD committee must review the child's IEP periodically, but not less frequently than annually, to determine whether the annual goals are being achieved.
Yeah, we do every 9 weeks with
Okay.
report cards.
Okay.
So we go through goals, objectives, and update those, and they go home with progress reports from the general ed classroom and grades if they're in.
By the case manager, right?
Mm-hmm.
Usually, okay. Except when accomplished through an amendment without a meeting, the ARD committee must revise the IEP as appropriate. Reflected in practice. Prior written notice. The parent understands that if the parent revokes consent, the revocation is not retroactive.
Mm-hmm.
It does not negate an action that has occurred after the consent was given and before the consent was revoked. And I put reflected in practice.
Yeah, we can't unring the bell. Like if we start an evaluation and they revoke consent, I still have to write up the pieces that we had. Like if I have parent information, teacher information, and I had done IQ, like the student that was withdrawn to go to the psychiatric unit, we had to write up what we had already done. They didn't revoke consent, but the same with revocation of consent. We still write up the pieces that we have.
Okay. The parent understands that the LEA must make reasonable efforts to obtain informed consent for an initial evaluation. Reflected in practice. The LEA must obtain informed consent from the parent before initially providing special education and related services to the child. I put documented in writing, and I guess that's also a part of the procedural safeguards.
Yeah, and we can go through the entire IEP and parents can agree with everything, but until they sign for initial consent for placement, we cannot serve them.
Okay. The LEA must comply with the parent and adult student frameworks as appropriate. I put reflected in practice. The new LEA in which the child enrolls must take reasonable steps to promptly obtain the child's record from the previous LEA in which the child was enrolled. Reflected in practice. Provide the child with a free and appropriate public education, including services comparable to those described in the IEP from the previous LEA. Reflected in practice. The obligation to make a do you say FAPE?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I've heard people say FAPE, but
yeah.
I say FAPE.
Yeah. I didn't know if people say FAPE. FAPE,
Yeah,
FAPE, that's funny. I'm sure you hear it all.
Sure.
To all children with disabilities does not apply to children aged 18 through 21 who, in the last educational placement prior to incarceration in an adult correctional facility, reflected in practice. If the state demonstrated a bona fide security or compelling penological interest that cannot otherwise be accommodated, the Student's Admission Review and Dismissal Committee may modify the child's IEP or placement, notwithstanding the least restrictive environment and IEP content requirements of the IDEA. and I put that was documented in writing. Private schools, this is an interesting section because we've been dealing so much with.
We've had 300 of them this year.
That's crazy. Timely and meaningful consult with representatives of private schools, documented in writing. The LEA must provide to the private school officials a written explanation of the reasons why the LEA chose not to provide services directly or through a contract if the LEA and private school officials disagree on the provision or types of services. And I put documented in writing. Parentally placed private school children with disabilities may receive a different amount of services than children with disabilities in public schools, reflected in practice.
And there's proportionate share as well, which it really doesn't say anything about, but we have money from the state that we need to allocate to our students that are privately placed or in homeschool, and we provide, most of those students are captured, the most amount of our students are captured through speech impairment, so we provide speech services for our students that are private or homeschool served.
Okay. And then that was it for part 1. And then for part 2, I just had to go through and say where I found information regarding the examples they gave.
Okay.
And it was either state rules or federal regulations. So that was pretty informative for me because I, sometimes don't realize what different things are regulated by the state or
versus
federal laws. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, the LEA must maintain an eligibility folder for each child, state rule. Excess cost requirements prevents the LEA from using IDEA Part B funds to pay for all the costs directly attributable to the education of the child with a disability, federal. And then also I had to put what section I found the information from. So it's
cool.
Organized.
So it's like a good resource.
Yes, for sure. Okay, and then we can go over this case. This is a case study for a girl named Sophia. So it says, Sophia is a 6-year-old student diagnosed with Down syndrome. She is nonverbal and relies on alternative communication methods like sign language and picture exchange communication systems. Her teachers have concerns about her ability to communicate and interact socially with peers, and they have referred her for an evaluation to determine whether she has a disability that requires special education services. The educational diagnostician is challenged with evaluating Sophia's cognitive abilities and social emotional development without the use of verbal language. Given her nonverbal status, the diagnostician must find ways to assess her capabilities accurately. The evaluation must be completed within the 60-day timeline. How should you proceed?
Well, I would start off by asking if this was actually an initial, because most of our students with Down syndrome or intellectual disabilities have been served, especially if she's nonverbal, have been served through preschool program for students with disabilities or ECAT now. So I would wonder if she had not received services, why we hadn't, but then we need to do our child find requirement and get consent for a full individual evaluation. We want to look at, and we're probably suspecting an intellectual disability with the student and a speech impairment. So we would start off with those. And then I would say we need to look at what tools to administer with this student. We want to honor all of their communication attempts, but we also need to do our assessments within standardized parameters.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to look at what can be administered with the student. The regular go-to for this age would be a WIPSI and a Wyatt, but a WIPSI is going to tell us a lot of things that she can't really do,
Mm-hmm.
but we need a verbal and a nonverbal score to look at an intellectual disability along with that adaptive behavior. So I would recommend that we start with the WIPSI, see if she can do the nonverbal pieces. We know she's going to struggle with the verbal pieces, but we need that numeric data. And then I would look at maybe doing a DP4, the developmental profile, sitting down with the parent and talking about what things can she do, what are our areas for growth, and then that could be scored. But I also might try a nonverbal assessment with her, doing the lighter or a C-Tony to see if that's a significant strength for the student and finding out some things that she is able to do nonverbally with nonverbal reasoning.
When you do a DP4, is the entire thing done with the parent?
The parent or the teacher, yes.
Oh, okay.
And you can just do pieces, but typically I like to do the whole thing to give me a better global picture of.
But this
of
isn't
the
something
student.
you pull a child for.
No.
Okay, it's
No,
just done with a.
There's a teacher checklist and a parent checklist.
Okay.
So you can look at, asking the parent, can they stack 3 blocks? Do they look at you? Do they track you when you move around the room? They're just very specific questions to ask, and it's either a yes or a no.
Okay.
And all of that will yield some standard scores.
Yes or no makes it much easier for parents.
Yes.
I know.
Well, and
Instead of the sometimes
the ABAS and the Vineland, I think both have a 2, a 1, or a 0. So, is it a 1? Is it a 2? Is it a 0? So
those
yes
ones
or
that
no.
always have like 5 different options, like sometimes, often, never. It's like you have to think about it. So
this is much
more
this is
straightforward.
simplified,
And then identify where you would locate this piece of information in the legal framework. So I know, having looked at the legal framework website, there is specific sections for Down syndrome, ID. So when working on a case like this, I would go into that folder and make sure that all of the guidelines for this specific disability were being followed.
But definitely working with a speech pathologist, and you might want to consider doing an arena play-based assessment to get some strengths and areas for growth as well, collaborating with the speech pathologist, because she's going to be the expert in the area of communication.
Okay. And with the PECS system and
100%.
okay.
Because a lot of times, students have PECS or they're working with augmentative communication, and there are some idiosyncrasies that are specific to that child, making sure that you're knowledgeable of how they communicate, and they're going to give you the card, or maybe they put the card on another card and put it with the Velcro stuff. So learning, doing some background with the teacher and the speech pathologist probably be helpful as well.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you.